Sorry, I should also have mentioned, I am a Southampton University graduate. No. I thought I might get a reaction. So I studied long ago here at Southampton, and I studied, originally I came here to study archaeology. Southampton's got a very good archaeology department, so Barry Cunliffe was here, and then Peter Ucko, so great historic archaeologists. But I ended up doing, for various reasons, I ended up doing philosophy, so I studied philosophy at Southampton University, and then went from here to Bristol and elsewhere. So I kind of did philosophy of religion, and that took me by a roundabout route into the world of theology. And you'll see some of that influencing what I'm going to share with you this evening. And I've always had an interest in archaeology, so I continued my interest in archaeology. And the wonderful thing is theology and archaeology join together, because obviously the Bible is set in a land that's very significant for archaeology historically. So I continue that involvement. I pop out to the Holy Land, various archaeological excavations I've been involved in, and I'm secretary of the New Forest Archaeological Society, so we do some of the local archaeology here as well. So I'm just explaining that because you'll see how it influences what I want to share with you this evening when we look at this very important topic, this great topic of the resurrection. And what is the evidence for the resurrection? What do we draw upon as evidence for whether we can be sure Jesus bodily rose from the grave, rose from the dead? Well, we know this historically has been something which has for 2,000 years been at the heart of our faith. And for 2,000 years, in various different ways, the symbolism, the calendar has been dominated by Easter, the cross, the death, the resurrection, the empty tomb, even down to the hot cross bun, which I hope many of you are enjoying. Now, the hot cross bun, of course, bears the symbol. You can't have the cross without the resurrection. You can't have the empty tomb without the crucifixion. They belong together. And so we'll think about them together tonight and what that means. But, controversially, if you went into Iceland this week, you may know Iceland issued their alternate version of the hot tick bun and removed the emblem of the cross, much to some controversy. Actually, it's kind of an ironic switch, that one, because to remove the cross and replace it with a tick looks remarkably similar to Nike's little tick symbol. And of course, Nike, this is of course the Greek god of victory. So there is a kind of, by a roundabout way, a reconnection with what we're sharing tonight. The cross is about victory. What looked like disaster and death in the end, because of the empty tomb and the resurrection, becomes a story of victory. It's a great big tick over history. And that's why for 2,000 years we've continued to share this message, because we don't see this as a reason for depression and despair, but a great reason for celebration. However, there are many objections, and maybe you here this evening have many doubts about the possibility of the resurrection. I have to say, with my background, the objections to the bodily resurrection of Jesus predominantly come from the world of philosophy. In other words, they are philosophical objections to the resurrection. So when I studied here at Southampton, I would find philosophers who are enjoyable to read. Not all philosophy is enjoyable to read. Let me just make that confession now. I've got no essays being marked, so I can just honestly say that. Some philosophy was quite hard work to read. But occasionally you'd come across an author who was a pleasure to read. David Hume was one of those. David Hume was the Scottish Enlightenment skeptic. Didn't believe in God, certainly agnostic, very skeptical, very funny, very humorous writer, very witty, and worth reading. So he wrote on the subject of miracles and the resurrection and denied the possibility. And what you notice with David Hume when you read him is the denial is fundamentally a philosophical denial. Let me give you David Hume's words first. No testimony, for example, a testimony to a miracle having occurred, the resurrection, no testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless it is of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact that it tries to establish. Now, what that means is that essentially it's more likely somebody told a lie than a miracle happened. Why? because miracles can't happen. Natural law shows us that a miracle is not possible. If somebody claims a miracle, that's far more likely to be a lie than it is to have actually happened. And this kind of skepticism has fed down through the centuries into a form of an objection, which we could call naturalism. It's the assumption that everything must be explained by natural processes. And a lie is a very obvious natural process that explains why somebody thinks a miracle may have happened. You see, this is philosophical. This is a presupposition or an assumption, or you might call it a bias. And that seems to me to be where most objections lie. If you read Richard Dawkins' The God Delusion, I don't think you'll find anything original outside of David Hume. The objections are already there in David Hume. He was a great writer, a witty scholar, an absolute skeptic, and he betrays and reveals this skepticism against the possibility of the miraculous. Now, I'm going to quote a few scholars tonight. And let me just say at the beginning with the quotations I'm going to use. Everyone I quote from this evening is somebody who would not agree with me in terms of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. Or at least they wouldn't agree with me regarding the implications of the bodily resurrection of Jesus. So what I'm trying to do tonight with any quotations is not to just quote people who would agree with me. I mean, I could do that and fill the evening that way. But I want to find common ground with people who don't believe. For those who are more skeptical, let's find some common ground. And the common ground is to refer to scholars who represent mainstream scholarship. They look at the history. They look at what we might call the facts. We'll talk about the facts later and what that word means. But they look at the common ground of what we can know from history, even if they don't agree with me in terms of the implications, the conclusions we can draw. So first of all, Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, anybody studying theology will come across Bart Ehrman. Bart Ehrman, Princeton graduate, then at North Carolina, is a New Testament scholar who's studied the manuscripts, the Greek manuscripts of the New Testament and the history of the beginnings of the church and so on. Bart Ehrman is an atheist who would certainly reject the implications I want to share with you this evening. But Bart Ehrman is clear, and this is mainstream scholarship. There's a lot of fundamental facts in the New Testament that are undeniable. By any normal historical processes, they are undeniable. These are the essential facts. Ehrman writes that Jesus' followers, and later Paul, had resurrection experiences is, in my judgment, a fact. What the reality was that gave rise to the experiences, I do not know. So he's not going to draw the implications I want to draw with you this evening. But in terms of the common ground, the New Testament body of material from most, and we're talking 99% of mainstream classics and historic scholars, the New Testament provides essential facts concerning a person who really existed, Jesus of Nazareth, a person who was really crucified, Jesus of Nazareth, a person who was buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and a claim that the tomb was empty. And that claim led to the conversion, even of hostile people, hostile like Paul, who was persecuting the early Christians, and led them to share in that same experience that Jesus had risen bodily from the dead. Now, of course, for much of what we need to look for in terms of evidence, we're talking about literary evidence. We're talking about the evidence of literature, writings that have been handed down, eyewitness material that has been written down and handed down. So, for example, let's just take this from Acts chapter 2, and I'll just read from my laptop here. So in Acts chapter 2, we read in verse 29, fellow Israelites, and this is Peter preaching at the very beginning of the church's experience in Acts chapter 2. Fellow Israelites, I can tell you confidently that the patriarch David died and was buried, and his tomb is here to this day. But he was a prophet and knew that God had promised him on oath that he would place one of his descendants on his throne. Seeing what was to come, he spoke of the resurrection of the Messiah, and he was not abandoned to the realm of the dead, nor did his body see decay. God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it. Now, that was written sometime probably before AD 64. That date is because Paul was executed in AD 64, and the book in which these words appear doesn't include the death of Paul. So it seems to come from the period before then, before AD 64. Jesus, let's just give you a date that everything can hang around. Jesus was executed sometime around AD 33, possibly a little bit earlier, maybe AD 30, but let's go with AD 33, so we've got a number to pin these things on. So this is written 30 or so years just after the claims regarding Jesus, and it refers back to the original preaching that took place. And what is this preaching? Well, Peter, in Jerusalem, 40 days after the execution of Jesus, Peter makes this astonishing comparison. He says, well, there are two people who died and were buried in Jerusalem. One was the great prophet David, and you can go and see his tomb to this day. We have his bones. You may know in Jewish tradition, there's a great concern for caring for the bones of those who die. Judaism had no place for cremation. You preserve the bones. Burial was very carefully carried out over the centuries. And so the burial of David meant that his bones were in a tomb and they knew where it was. However, 40 days ago, Jesus had been executed and buried in a tomb, and they had no bones. The bones were not to be found. Peter is claiming that you can go to where the tomb of David is. You know the bones are there. You can go to the tomb of Jesus, this family tomb of Joseph of Arimathea, and the bones are not there. The body did not see decay. So that's the claim that is made. And that's where the church begins on what's called the day of Pentecost. Now, in terms of the literature, because we're talking about writings here, how plausible are these writings? That was what we need to explore. Can we trust eyewitness evidence? Can we trust this written material? It's really important to remember here that this material is not simply the preserve of devout Christians who believe it's the Word of God. The New Testament writings are part of mainstream scholarship, and they've been subjected, and this is not an exaggeration, to more detailed critical scholarship than any other text from the classical world. And there's a vast amount of manuscript evidence that we can draw upon to weigh up and evaluate what was originally written, when those things were written, and what the motivations were. And so I don't need to just draw upon Christians to talk about how we interpret these writings that we draw from. In fact, one particularly interesting scholar to draw attention to here is the Jewish rabbi theologian Pinchas Lapid of the last century. Now, Lapid was not a Christian. He was an Orthodox Jewish theologian, and he studied the New Testament. Why wouldn't you, as a Jewish scholar? The New Testament is very important for first century Judaism, alongside the work of Josephus. So as a Jewish theologian studying the New Testament, very important document for Jewish history. You know, the first reference to Hanukkah, the festival of lights in Judaism, is found in the Gospel of John. It's a reference to Hanukkah. So for Jewish history, the New Testament has its important place. And Pinchas Lapid, looking at this evidence, is convinced of a resurrection. Not only a historic Jesus, not only an empty tomb, but some kind of resurrection. Lapid writes, I accept the resurrection of Easter Sunday not as an invention of the community of disciples, but as a historical event. Now, he doesn't draw the implications I'm going to draw from it, but he sees that the evidence is there. The literature itself provides us with compelling evidence that there was an empty tomb and that there was an experience of a risen, resurrected Jesus 3 days later. So how do we find this evidence in terms of literature? Well, let's pause for a moment and let me go off on a little segue with you for a few moments this evening. And let me just hold in my hand something this is the kind of thing that makes my spine tingle, right? This is an oil lamp. It's not a replica, it's an oil lamp from Samaria. And it's about 2,750 years old. It would still function tonight, this oil lamp. If you put oil in it, put a wick in it, it would still burn and give you light for an hour or so in your house. That is from the latest 722 BC. So it's over 2,700 years old. And it's from Samaria. the northern kingdom of Israel. And this oil lamp is the stuff of archaeology. This is one of the reasons why some of us get so drawn into archaeology. I mean, we love the replicas as well. But, when you hold in your hands something of that antiquity and you think, I wonder what stories this could tell. I wonder which Israelite owned this lamp, because it was an Israelite oil lamp. Very distinctive design to it, and it's the fashion of that time. It's a style of oil lamp that Jesus didn't know, by the way. Jesus wouldn't have used an oil lamp like this. This had changed by that time. This is the kind of oil lamp that they were using nearly 3,000 years ago. And that makes my spine tingle. That's why I like to dig in the ground. Whether it's in the New Forest or whether it's on the shores of the Sea of Galilee, we can hold in our hands things that connect us to the ancient world. Now, this is an image. It's not just a pretty picture. Well, it's not that pretty a picture, to be honest. But this is an image of the storehouse in the Holy Land for archaeological artifacts that have no room in museums. It is bursting at the seams. In fact, there was an article on the news a couple of weeks ago calling in the state of Israel for the pause on any more archaeological excavations. They just want to stop them for a year or two, because there is so much material in the Holy Land that's not yet been catalogued properly, that's certainly not on display, and there is an enormous warehouse. They're extending this warehouse underground. It's a huge kind of bunker, which has shelf after shelf, cabinet after cabinet of archaeological artifacts that are not on display. Now, all of that is because the Holy Land is a real hunting ground for archaeology, because there is so much material there. Textbooks go out of date very quickly. When we talk confidently about what archaeology can show us about the Bible or the time of Jesus, literally every year something new emerges. Literally every decade you'll find textbooks have faults in them. Literally every 50 years a textbook is redundant. You'd have to completely rewrite it with new material that's emerging. And I have to tell you, in looking at that material evidence from archaeology, the literature of the New Testament continues to demonstrate its authenticity, its reliability, that it is written from that time and place, that it fits with what we know of the ancient world, and that material evidence is accumulating over time. It's looking better and better for the New Testament, not worse and worse. Let me give you an example. Pontius Pilate. We know more and more about Pontius Pilate as time goes by. We have the literature, the Roman governor in Judea at the time of Jesus. We'll take a look at this ring. This was found, this particular ring was found in 1968-69, during that season. It was found with lots of other archaeological debris and placed in store boxes. 1968-69 was the time, at a place called Herodion, not far from Bethlehem. And put away in store boxes and not seen again until 2017. Because in 2017, they cleaned this little copper ring. They couldn't see anything particularly on it when it was found, so it was just boxed away. And when they cleaned it, if you look on the image, the drawing on the right-hand side, it brings it out more clearly. You'll see letters going from the top right down and then round. And if you do your maths, you'll know on the top right-hand side, that's the pi symbol, which is P in Greek. And if you follow the letters round, it's saying Palato, which is of Pilate. Now, the Herodion was a palace that was used by Pontius Pilate at the time of Jesus. And this is a signet ring bearing the name of Pilate, Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor. It had been in a store box for decades. It hadn't been looked at until they found that they had to use some very special cleaning kit. And then when they realized what they had, of course, this made public news and went on display. We're not just talking about artifacts that indicate that Pilate existed. We're talking about something that can get us back to maybe even the hand that was wearing this ring was the very hand of Pontius Pilate when he had Jesus stand before him. And that's the kind of archaeology that's emerging as the decades go by, more and more that illustrates the world of Jesus. Now, let me very quickly illustrate how this goes for places, for example, in the world of the New Testament. Capernaum. We did not know much about Capernaum, the hometown of Jesus, again until the 1960s, when archaeology began to develop in terms of excavations on the northern shore of Galilee. And from the 1960s onwards, excavations has revealed to us some remarkable things about the town of Capernaum in the first century. The presence of a synagogue, the presence of houses and roads, and the world of Matthew, the tax collector, and so on. And one of the most stunning finds is the ground zero of churches, the earliest church anywhere in the world. What it is a simple house, which would have been rectangular in shape in the first century, a simple home of a humble fishing family on the shore of Galilee in Capernaum, that then got modified into a very simple little church building. And it then got modified into a slightly larger, but quite small, Byzantine church. And then it got enlarged into a slightly more substantial, octagonal church, but still fairly small. And the only explanation that can be given for why a simple dwelling in Capernaum from the first century was in use through to the 4th century, when it was then abandoned, there was an earthquake later, but the only suitable explanation is this was a significant house. And what significant house do we have in Capernaum? The home base of Jesus of Nazareth. He came from Nazareth, but he settled in Capernaum during his ministry. This is considered to be the only explanation. This is the home of Simon Peter. Simon Peter's mother was here. We read about that in the Gospels. And that Jesus made this his home base. And that would explain why a simple, humble dwelling of the first century is modified, turned into a simple church, and becomes a ground zero for church architecture, an octagonal Byzantine church building. Only since the 1960s, 1970s did we know that. By the way, if you go and visit it today, just incidentally, if you go and visit it today, you don't see it like that because they built a church on top. So you see a very large Roman Catholic church built right over the top of that octagonal structure. But all is not lost. Go inside. It's got a glass floor and it's air conditioned. It's cooler than in here. And you can look down the glass floor beneath you. You can see that octagonal structure. Quite something. Until about 20 years ago, we always said, and I would have said as well, Nazareth was a very, very simple little village. And that's substantially true, about the size of a football pitch. There's not much in Nazareth from the time of Jesus. Nowadays, big city. At the time of Jesus, Nazareth was very simple place. There's not much in Nazareth. And skeptics would use that to dismiss the Gospels and say, how can Jesus come from the town of Nazareth when it was so poor and simple? Now, I didn't find that particularly significant as an argument. We read in the Gospels, can anything good come from Nazareth? It was a despised place. It wasn't a wealthy place. And the word town, well, in the Bible, in Greek, polis could mean a village. It didn't need to mean a very significant city. However, things have moved on. Just in recent years, archaeologists in Nazareth have now discovered a town house. A proper house, not just a simple dwelling in a cave, which is what we had known about, but a more substantial stone-built house. And now, Nazareth is a busy town, very difficult to excavate there. You're among the houses and the churches and so on. But this is very promising. So Ken Dark, who's excavated here, he's pointed out you cannot say this is the home of Jesus. We mustn't sort of jump ahead. There's no sort of a sign at the door saying Jesus lived here. Let's not jump ahead. What we do now know is that Nazareth was a significant place. It had a significant house, at least one. And as excavations continue, watch and see. This is just from the last few years. Watch and see what else will emerge from Nazareth. But we can be much more confident now about first century Nazareth, the hometown of Jesus. I could fill the whole evening talking about the next location, which is where I've been excavating, but I can't do that with you. But just to mention another town we knew nothing about until around the turn of the millennium, late 1990s into 2000. Because there was a lost town in the Gospels, the town of Bethsaida. No one knew where Bethsaida was. It's an important town in the Gospels. It appears in all 4. And the skeptics could say, well, there is no town of Bethsaida. It's a confusion. The gospel writers have nothing to go on. And then from the late 1990s, a discovery at Et Tel on the northern shore of the Sea of Galilee led to archaeologists excavating what has now become a very significant first century town. Again, I could spend the whole evening talking about it, but Bethsaida is now very much back in our understanding as Et Tel has been excavated. And in the last 3 or 4 years, this is very up to date, Another location just closer to the shoreline, El Araj, a Byzantine church has been found with a mosaic floor with the names of the apostles. Now, 3 of the apostles came from Bethsaida, so it's a remarkable discovery. And that's hot off the press stuff, so still waiting for the dust to settle. But 20 years ago, the books would say, we have no Bethsaida, got nothing to go on. Today, we are overwhelmed with material, and we're still trying to interpret how we can understand what this tells us about the Bethsaida of the time of Jesus. Can't even begin to elaborate on Jerusalem because so much is being revealed. Every year you go back to Jerusalem, there's more to see. But just to tell you one thing about Jerusalem from the last couple of years, the Pool of Siloam, important pool from the time of Jesus in the first century. The Pool of Siloam has been, for many years, identified with a very simple little pool in Jerusalem. And tourists would go there, they'd walk through a little tunnel underground and come out into this little pool, and that would be the Pool of Siloam. We now know that wasn't the Pool of Siloam. That was a later Byzantine pool. But the real Pool of Siloam from the first century has now been found. And it's the size of 2 Olympic swimming pools, absolutely enormous. And the excavations are continuing right now. And as part of the excavations, the picture on the screen that's only one section of it. That's underground, that tunnel you're looking at. It's a tunnel that's excavating an underground roadway. It's a pilgrim's road. It's quite wide, actually. That's just one section that leads from the Pool of Siloam, which was a ritual washing pool, to the very temple where the Israelites would worship. New discovery, and only now is that being opened up in terms of public access. Well, let's get one thing in Jerusalem really close in our minds, and I got to keep an eye on the time because I know I can elaborate too much sometimes. But death and burial at the time of Jesus. We know more and more about death and burial at the time of Jesus. Picture on the screen is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. This is a very interesting site. Now, if you like incense and icons and all that kind of thing, you'll love it, I guess. I don't like that kind of thing particularly, but what I do like is the archaeology that's here. Because this particular church is a very ancient church. It goes back to the 4th century. It was excavated by the mother of Constantine, the Roman emperor, the so-called conversion of Constantine. Well, she didn't personally excavate it. She got soldiers and laborers to excavate it. But Helena, the mother of Constantine, excavated what had been a Roman temple, a pagan temple. She had it destroyed and excavated beneath to reveal where tradition had pointed to the place of the skull, where Jesus had been crucified, and a nearby quarry of tombs where Jesus had been buried. And going on that tradition, going on those stories, she had an excavation carried out which revealed what would then be built upon with this church. You can see the 2 grey domes, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. From an archaeological perspective, it is absolutely fascinating because it is a Roman stone quarry abandoned in the 1st century and turned into tombs. And while a lot of religious paraphernalia gets in the way, you've got to kind of go behind the scenes a little bit, the tombs are still there. Tombs that belong to the type of burial going on at the time of Jesus. And this is the kind of burial from the time of Jesus. This is an ossuary, a bone box. When someone died during this particular period, and it's only actually really from in the 1st century BC to 70 AD that one particular style of burial went on. It modified over time. But during the time of Jesus, this was exactly the style of burial. When someone, I'm going to get gruesome, okay? So for 1 or 2 minutes, this is going to be a bit, if you're squeamish, sorry, but this is how it was. A body, when you died, would be laid out in a communal kind of tomb, a family tomb. And for 1 year, it would be allowed to decompose. The spices would be used to stop the smell getting too bad. And then after a year, as the body had been decomposed, that's how long it took, the bones would be gathered together, placed in an ossuary, and then pushed into a niche, a little cavity within this tomb, this family tomb. The one on the screen is one of, thousands have been found, these ossuaries. Many ossuaries have been found. This particular one on the screen, they have names scratched on them, not always, but sometimes. This one belongs to Caiaphas, the high priest, that we read about in the Gospels. It's the actual bone box. And this is on display in the Israel Museum. Now, it has been said that Jesus If he was executed by the Romans, he would have been considered cursed by the Jews, and he would not have been given a proper burial. John Hick is somebody that I studied under in my philosophy days. And John Hick argued that the body of Jesus would have been thrown out into the rubbish. He would have been considered cursed from hanging on a tree, dying such a terrible death. His body would have been discarded, eaten by dogs, or burned up with the garbage. Now, that was a claim that's gone around for a long time, that they would not have buried the victim of crucifixion. But we now know that that is just not true. Actually, throughout the Roman world, we know that those who were crucified could be given proper burials. The most important one for our purposes this evening, and again, sorry if you're squeamish, but on the left-hand side, you'll see the very interesting part of the skeletal remains from an ossuary that was found in Jerusalem, in East Jerusalem. Again, in the 1960s, the ossuary was found, and it contained the skeletal remains of a first-century Jew who had been crucified, Johannes. And you've got the heel bone that not only still has the nail through the heel bone, but still olive wood attached to it from the crucifixion. The one on the right-hand side, by the way, is from 2017. That's actually from Cambridgeshire. That's obviously not Jewish, but it's the first century Roman crucifixion of a Celt. And this also is given a proper burial. Now, that's not related to Judaism, so I hesitate to use it. But we actually have 4 remains now from the first century of people who were crucified by the Romans and given proper burials from elsewhere in the world, but one from Jerusalem. So Jesus was given a proper burial. Now, all of this brings us back in closing to the literary evidence. And I want to just major on this as we come to an end. And you may have questions that you want to ask, but it's the literary evidence we come back to. And all that we've said emphasizes you can trust the literature. The archaeology demonstrates that the Gospels and the New Testament are founded on real history. And as the material evidence continues to emerge, we have more and more good reason to trust the evidence. So Mark chapter 16. Here is a very simple, brief account of an empty tomb. But when they, Mary Magdalene, Mary and Salome, looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And as they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he said. "You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they laid him, but go, tell his disciples and Peter. He is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him just as he told you." Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now, what I just want you to notice from that short, and it's only one of the 4 main resurrection accounts, that short account is how simple it is, how unpretentious it is, how it even has embarrassing contents. You see, in the first century, a woman's eyewitness testimony was not considered of value. It was certainly not of the value of a man's eyewitness evidence in a court of law. And yet Mark refers to the eyewitness evidence of 3 women. It would be an embarrassment if it were not true in the first century. And the account itself does not elaborate on it. Mark, for various, literary reasons, leaves it at this point. And the point he leaves it as is they were terrified and bewildered. They were not expecting the resurrection of Jesus. They thought it was over. The disciples had fled. The women who remained were bewildered. They had not expected this to happen. It is a source of embarrassment, but that is the truth. This is not something they were making up or expecting or predicting. In Judaism, there is an expectation of a physical bodily resurrection, but that's of all people at the end of time, not of this one figure in the middle of time. And so Mark chapter 6 provides us with this very simple description, and it fits a pattern in the New Testament, a pattern that's so overwhelming when you read these accounts that Antony Flew, who was an atheist philosopher that I read when he was an atheist. So when I was here at Southampton University, Antony Flew in the philosophy of religion was used as one of the atheist philosophers, and we dutifully read Antony Flew and made our comments on him in our essays in philosophy of religion here at Southampton. Little did I know, when I was writing those essays, that Antony Flew would come to change his mind. Flew came to believe in God and wrote this about the resurrection. The evidence for the resurrection is better than for the claimed miracles in any other religion. It's outstandingly different in quality and quantity. What we're reading here in the New Testament is not like any other kind of supernatural or superstitious claims made anywhere in other religions. And so let me finish with one final quote. Am I okay on time? Let me just check. Yeah, I'm okay. I've got a nod. So I want to finish with one final quote and make a few comments about this as we then take a pause. And this is from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Now, bear in mind, when I'm talking about the Gospels in the New Testament, the Gospels aren't necessarily the earliest writings in the New Testament. And even the letters themselves, there are letters in the New Testament, quote earlier material. So in New Testament studies, there are a number of passages that are considered the earliest ones of all. We're not looking at this now, but Philippians chapter 2 and Colossians chapter 1 would be considered some of the earliest writings of the New Testament. Because they are quotations being used in letters, they must have been circulating before. And when you come to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, Paul, in this letter, writing AD 53 to 55, somewhere in that period, is quoting a confession, a creedal statement. And it's a creed or a confession that was known by the Corinthians in Greece, Corinth. So he is quoting something that must have been circulating and they must have been aware of. It is one of the kind of simple early forms of the gospel, the good news that was being shared. And it goes like this, 1 Corinthians 15 verse 3. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. And after that he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all he appeared to me also, as to one abnormally born. Now, this literary evidence here in 1 Corinthians is remarkable for how early it goes. When we look at the earliest material of the New Testament, we find the simplest, strongest statements of that quality eyewitness material. Here we have a creed that's circulating that includes reference to 500 people seeing the risen Jesus at one time. Not like a personal, subjective experience, but 500 together. And Paul points out some are still alive. You can go and talk to them. James, the brother of Jesus, who would have been a hostile witness at first because the family of Jesus found it very hard to understand what Jesus was doing. I mean, James would have seen his brother Jesus growing up in the same house. He was not an early believer, and yet he came to believe and became one of the first leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And then Paul himself, that great opponent of the Christian faith, came to faith himself and includes himself as one abnormally born. Now the point is that if the resurrection of Jesus is around 33 AD, and 20 years later Paul is quoting a creed that's in circulation, that's had years to get from Jerusalem to Corinth, this must date back very, very early. So early that there are some scholars who date this to within the creed, to within just a few months of the resurrection. This gets you back to the very sound of what the early Christians were saying at the very beginning of the New Testament period. And then it spreads from there. Back to Pinchas Lapide, who Rudolf Bultmann I wanted to quote from. Bultmann, another very skeptical theologian, died a number of years ago. But Bultmann, very liberal, very critical of the New Testament in many different ways. But look what he says about this description. Typical encounters with the recently deceased do not issue in claims about an empty tomb, nor do they lead to the founding of a new religion. And they certainly do not typically eat and drink like Jesus did. And they are not seen by crowds of up to 500 people. In other words, the flavor of this eyewitness material is not legend or myth, or mere subjective experience. There is something very simple, almost crude, but therefore more believable about this eyewitness material that we read. And I do want to finish with a quote from Pinchas Lapid, so I'll just move down 2 slides. That Jewish author who I referred to, so I just need to go back a slide, thank you. Pinchas Lapid, the Jewish theologian that I mentioned. The conviction that Jesus had risen from the dead had already taken root by the time Paul was converted, about 33 CE. That's the new language for AD, by the way. On the assumption that Jesus died about 30 CE, the time for development was thus 2 or 3 years at most. So you see, Pinchas Lapid is putting the dating for the death of Jesus around 30 and saying, look, the evidence shows the belief in the resurrection goes back to within years or maybe even months of the event itself. This is not given time for a legend to form. This goes right back to the ground zero of the event itself. And so it is that this message has now spread far and wide for 2,000 years. Picture on the screen is the very earliest image of the crucifixion we've ever found. It comes from Rome, from the Palatine Hill in Rome. And it's a description of Aleximenos, a little boy worshipping his God. And it shows a graffiti. The earliest image of the crucifixion is by enemies of the church. It's a graffiti of a little boy worshipping Jesus, but Jesus depicted as a donkey-headed God, crucified. Because the crucifixion is seen as something that is humiliating, it is weak, it is powerless. And in the mighty Roman Empire, to be crucified would be considered weakness. And for Judaism, crucifixion would be considered impure. And yet, this message of a crucified Messiah has gone on for 2,000 years to spread and go global. How do we explain it? Well, the resurrection changes everything. That crucified God is not the donkey-headed God left in a tomb, but he's the risen Savior who's been transforming lives for 2,000 years. And compounding to the archaeological evidence and the literary evidence for who Jesus is 2,000 years of history of Jesus transforming lives.